I was raised on benefits, and I had to overcome the 5 worst pieces of advice ever to find success in my life. I grew up in a string of council houses. My family was poor. We weren't even working class. We were benefits class for the whole of my childhood, entirely dependent on government handouts until I left home at the ripe old age of 16 and got my first job. I never had a silver spoon in my mouth. A wooden spoon would have been appreciated. I was born into the poverty trap, and I realized quite young that I didn't want my life to stay like that forever. So in my 30s, I started my own business, and in the beginning, I was terrible at it. And that was because I had been following the 5 worst pieces of advice ever. But then a change in my life started to happen. As one by one, I abandoned those pieces of advice, and I honestly believe that no matter where you start from, no matter where you come from, even if you were raised in a disadvantaged way, you too can escape the poverty trap. You just have to stop following the 5 worst pieces of advice ever. So let's have a look at the 5 worst pieces of advice ever in reverse order. Now, number 1 is a real gem, by the way, and I pretty much guarantee that 99% of all the people watching this video have been told to follow it at some point in their life. So at number 5, the 5th worst piece of advice ever. So when I was a child, I was a member of a very poor family on a very poor street in a very rundown city, and I quickly learned that the worst thing you could do was look poor. You get to experience a lot of prejudice when you are poor, growing up on benefits, and people can see that. So one day my dad brought home a new pair of shoes from a bargain bin shoe shop sale. I must have been about 7 years old. I was so excited to get some new shoes, as the old plimsolls were wearing a bit thin. I took them out of the box and my gaze fell on the ugliest pair of shoes in the history of the universe. A rectangular pair of shoes, so rectangular they had corners on them. Never mind the 1-inch sole that weighed about a kilogram each. They looked like they had been designed for Frankenstein to wear. Now I knew I was going to get beat up just for wearing them in public. So the next day I took them to school, and on the way to school I threw them in a bin. I popped the old faithful plimsolls back on, and when I got home, I told my dad, "Someone nicked my shoes during PE, Dad." Fortunately, he fell for it. But that helped me fall into the trap of believing the 5th worst piece of advice ever, and that is keep up with the Joneses. It took me a while to learn that self-respect was more important than what other people thought of me. I always wanted to prove those people who looked down on me wrong. There's so much prejudice in society for kids who are raised on benefits, little comments here and there, being refused access to the top schools when the schools look at your postcode and reject you, even if you have extremely high grades. Ask me how I know. There is also a reason young kids from the poorest parts of society put so much importance on the clothes they wear. This is a pushback against prejudice and often an attempt to hide their social standing. They don't want people looking down on them because they've learned that appearance is everything. Now they may dress in a way that identifies them to their cultural background, but they will value brands very highly and will often be very precise about how they look. And they learn to look after their clothes. Even to this day, I take very careful care of my clothes, and I'll often not wear them at all so that they last. I am essentially saving them for a special occasion. I'm obviously working on that now I know it's an issue. I also have a thing for shoes. I now find it hard to pass up a shoe sale. I wonder why. But then a point came when I realised that my own self-respect was all I needed to worry about, and that other people's opinions didn't matter if they didn't have genuine care and concern for me. And that meant I could start living my life for myself and focus instead on taking care of those around me that valued my friendship and didn't care where I came from. I learned the valuable lesson that you should not value yourself based on someone else's opinion, and that should not be your motivation, because you will never be happy with what you have. It doesn't matter how shiny your car is. People who don't like you because of where you came from will still find something to pull you down with. And that was a major victory for me when I realized that my own self-respect was what mattered. And I encourage you to adopt this principle as well if you find yourself suffering from acceptance issues and have experienced societal prejudice because you were born into a poor family like I was, or you have not had the best of upbringings. At number 4, the 4th worst piece of advice ever. Money would see me coming and run away screaming in terror. I could never hold on to a penny I earned. My first thought when I got some money was, what can I buy with this? Growing up on benefits meant money was something other people had. So whenever I had it, I would immediately spend it and enjoy that money. I had been listening to the fourth worst piece of advice ever. Spend it whilst you have it. Then one day I heard about this strange concept called budgeting. At first I resisted it, but after a while I learned to stop distrusting this idea of budgeting. Because I was raised on benefits, everything in my pocket was already in a budget, my spending money budget. Fortunately, my wife is a master of budgeting, and I learned from her that budgets control expenses. And once I realized that budgeting creates wealth, I was all in. How about you? Does money see you coming and run away in terror? So why does this happen? Most of the time, people that come from poverty operate on a simple budget. It is called the wallet budget. Whatever was in my wallet was mine to be spent on fun and leisure. I used to spend everything I had the moment I got it. If I had enough money to get me through the weekend, I was impressed. It was a good job that I got paid weekly when I was young. But when you're running a business, you can soon learn that you have to control your money if you want to stay out of trouble with the tax man. But that is a negative motivation and doesn't often work with people. What changed for me was realizing that budgeting created wealth. And that meant adopting the principle of deferred gratification. Not buying something until I had the money for it actually meant I could have more stuff further down the line, that it would actually make me wealthier. So I learned the value of creating budgets for everything and letting them fill up before I spent the money on the things I needed. So now when I want something, I can look into those budgets and voila, the money is there. Or if it isn't, I know I just have to wait for that monthly amount that goes into that budget each month to build up, and then I can buy it. The second, and probably most important thing, is that by controlling expenditure in my life and business through budgeting, I maximize the profits I am generating. I can then reinvest those profits back into my business to improve efficiency and productivity, or to start new sources of income to create new businesses. Don't increase the budgets. This is a common mistake. As I earn more money, I keep them the same, which provides a comfortable but not extravagant lifestyle. And that means I'm now compounding my profits. The more of my profits I reinvest, the more my wealth grows. And I just keep doing that and doing that. And I use the power of compounding to create wealth. So that is why I love budgeting. It is the rail track for the engine of wealth. It helps me to get to my destination in the quickest and most direct way possible. At number 3, the third worst piece of advice ever. Is there anything more mind-numbingly depressing than a Sunday afternoon when you remember that Monday morning is running towards you like a pack of wolves who have decided that you look like lunch? I hated Mondays so much that I didn't do Mondays, which meant I had 35 jobs under my belt by the time I was 30. Apparently, employers don't like people that don't turn up on Mondays. Who would have thought? Then one day I realized I had been following the third worst piece of advice ever, and that was get a job and sell your time for money. Selling my time for money meant I never kept the profits from my labor. I always gave it to someone else. I became an asset for them. I was making the owners of the business I worked for rich whilst I struggled. So I decided to become an entrepreneur and learned how to create assets and hold on to the profits of my labor. I didn't have a clue how to do that, of course, but the decision was made and off I went, never to return to a job again. Now I own my own time fully and I've never been happier. So if you want to get rid of those Monday blues, seriously reconsider this particular piece of advice. Now I have a strict rule. I do not sell any of my time to anybody because it makes me miserable, always has done, and is an extremely inefficient way to create wealth. Have you ever considered that you might be suffering from the Monday morning blues because deep down you have an entrepreneurial spirit that you are suppressing? I now spend all of my time creating assets, and I haven't had a client or employer for about 7 years now. All of my income is residual in nature and comes from assets that keep earning me money. There is also something very satisfying about sacking bad clients, but that's a story for another time. Remind me to tell you that one. At the beginning, When I started creating assets, it was tough because I had to learn a whole new mindset. I had to change the way I thought about time and how to invest my time. But as I changed my thought processes, as I started following objective financial and business principles, success started flowing my way. And what was foundational to that was learning to take control of my time and using my time to create assets rather than selling that to other people. So I encourage you to start taking control of a little bit of your time. Maybe try to find 5 hours a week and use that to learn how to create digital assets that you will enjoy creating. That step alone will launch you down the path of owning your own business. And I budget my time. Like I budget my money, I invest most of my time into creating new digital assets, growing new businesses. I now run just one of my businesses, which has a full-time, very comfortable income, and it costs me just 2 hours a week. And now I have set it up and have gotten it to a profitable state. And that means I have time to build out new businesses, to diversify my income, and do more of the things that I love to do, like creating YouTube content like this that helps budding entrepreneurs that might have come from a poor background or who have never had the guidance in their lives to enable them to think like entrepreneurs. The first real step you need to take if you want to take back control of your life is to decide to take back control of your time and decide to use it to create sources of residual income. If you want to control your life, you have to control your time. And number 2, the second worst piece of advice ever. I had a natural flair for growing a business. From early childhood, I was trained to ninja levels of expertise in this one particular business model. Growing up, raised on benefits, gave me all the experience I needed. The business? I was an expert at growing debt and feeding the banks and the credit card companies' business. It was like I just wanted to give the banks as much of my money as I could. I had fallen into the trap of following the second worst piece of advice ever. Borrow money so you can be successful in life. But the only people that were successful when that piece of advice was followed were the people lending me the debt. I was growing the credit card company's business. I was brilliant at it, and I carried that into my early businesses, and it took me years to get out of debt and to recover from that bad piece of advice. But that all stopped several years ago when I decided not to borrow anymore. Understand this, debt is a cancer to your wealth. I was raised on debt, addicted to debt, and anything in my life of any value that I had was bought on debt. I had a PhD for being in debt. If I cleared a debt, then I would take that monthly payment amount that I was using to pay that debt and immediately buy something else with that monthly amount. So if I was paying something off at, say, £50 per month, as soon as that debt was clear, I would find something else expensive that I could buy for that £50 a month. I was budgeting for the debt companies. I did that because that was the way I'd been raised, in a constant cycle of debt. It's interesting that they never teach poor kids the danger of debt and the debt cycle in maths class, isn't it? And I kept doing that until it all caught up to me, until circumstances changed and I could no longer generate the same amount of income that I needed to furnish the debt payments. But there was another problem. Every time I purchased something on debt, I paid 30% plus over the odds for it. I overpaid for everything. And that meant the profits of my labor was being extracted by the banks. Think about that. Everything I bought was 30% more than it needed to be. It cost 30% more than it needed to. Some people are so trapped in debt that they even have to buy food on a credit card. Imagine having to pay 30% extra for all your food. Did you know that if you buy a house with a mortgage, you will pay 60% more than it actually costs on a typical 25-year mortgage? There are other ways to buy a house, but most people don't even know that it's possible because they're so well trained in the system. They're so well trained to work for the banks. Did you also know that the first few years of your mortgage payment is interest only? That means if you cannot pay your mortgage, the bank will come, take your house, sell it to the next person, the next asset that comes along, and leave you with nothing. You will have paid all those years of interest and you will own nothing. Does that sound familiar? And now there is talk of 40 or 50-year mortgages. 40 or 50-year debt traps. So if you are struggling, then the best way out of debt is to start creating assets. Draw a line under your borrowing, stop borrowing, and focus on creating assets. Digital assets that can be sold online are especially powerful right now. Videos, books, resources, training courses, websites, there are so many ways you can make money online. It has never been easier to create residual sources of income. I honestly believe that most people can find something they can create, enjoy, and make an online income out of with a little bit of training, a good plan, and a diligent attitude. And now with AI, you can hire a full team of workers to help you build that business up even quicker than you used to be able to. But that is a whole other topic of conversation, and I recommend you check out my videos on AI and how you can use that in your business. Now, this is not just a theory. This is what I did. At one point, I was in a position where the bank was threatening to start proceedings if I failed another mortgage payment. Fortunately, I found a way to create strong digital assets, monetize my skill sets, and I have now moved out of that city where I grew up. And I am living in a big house that is a 5-minute walk to the beach. I am debt-free, mortgage-free, and I don't owe anybody anything. Everything I have, I own. I escaped the raised on benefits lifestyle. But most of all, I learned that genuine wealth is not a dollar amount. Wealth is owning my own time and being able to choose what I do with it rather than someone else choosing what I do with it. And that piece of freedom is not something that you can put a price on. How did I do this? I learned the value of creating assets that make me money independent of my direct input. I created a plan, I stuck to the plan, and now I'm living my dream life. I am telling you this in the hope that you can be inspired to do the same. And number 1, the worst piece of advice ever. So what is the worst piece of advice ever? Follow your heart. With no one around me to teach me how to succeed in life, no one to teach me how to follow principle, I fell into the trap of following negative and damaging emotions. Impulses is another way of saying it, which is the default position of human nature. And this is very common when you've been raised on benefits, as the people around you are often lost to their own impulses, which keeps them in the debt cycle, so they can't teach you any better. And this got me into all sorts of trouble in my early life. But I got out of that. I learned how to follow principle over emotion. I learned how to think like an entrepreneur. I realized that life is a business and you must run your life like a business. So if you want the worst piece of advice ever, here it is. Follow your heart. It is brilliant at leading people into abject failure. But as we grow older, our intellect develops and we start to replace emotional responses to life's problems with measured force based on principle, which results in principled action and success. The problem comes when we have areas in our life where we have not learned to hand control over from the heart to the intellect, when we have not matured in that area where we respond impulsively to situations and choices in an emotionally charged way. It can be relationships, money, business, health, any area of our life where we do not adopt principle, where we want to follow impulse and emotion instead, we will fail in that area. You see, we're so used to following our heart that when the heart comes forward with strong, emotive, impulsive suggestions, we listen to that and think, this seems desirable, and we act on it. We often don't even realize that we are listening to an emotional response. We think that emotional message is actually our identity. But just because I experience emotional impulses does not mean I am those emotional impulses. My identity is rooted in my intellect, not my emotions. But it gets even worse. And here's an example how. Oftentimes in life, in difficult and challenging situations, we're just responding to something based on stored emotional responses to negative situations in our emotional history. And as we repeat that response to those similar situations, those emotional storehouses grow and our negative emotional reactions get stronger and we get trapped in a behavior loop. We become ruled by feeling. Here's a simple example of how that might affect us. Have you ever seen someone for the first time and instantly dislike them just based on their looks? This is likely because you have had a bad experience with someone who they remind you of, someone they look like. Now think about that in business, in sales, where you're often dealing with difficult people at the best of time. If we have a learned negative emotional response to someone who looks a certain way, and that emotional response manifests in the middle of a sales meeting, and the other person picks up on that, and they will, then we have just lost a sale. We could have spent months building that sale, but an emotional response or an emotional impulse can destroy all that hard work in a moment. People know when you don't like them. They pick that vibe up quite quickly, especially if you manifest any emotion and you give that emotion away through expression, through micro expressions in your face, through the tone of your voice. People pick it up. They realize it's going on. And you can't hide it. Another downside is that we often act on these emotional impulses and it feels good for a while, but then the intellect kicks back in and we realize we have made a mistake. We feel guilt and regret and we enter into self-condemnation. And here is the kicker. The heart, the emotions that encourage you to follow its advice, now condemns you for following its advice. Have you noticed how you can struggle to accept responsibility in a situation when your emotions are fired up, but when you calm down, you can see what you did wrong, that you experience remorse and regret? That is your intellect kicking back in. The prefrontal lobe literally shuts down when strong emotional messages are sent to the brain. This is scientifically observable and has been studied and documented. So out of control emotion stops you being able to think. If someone doesn't experience any regret and they never seem to have their intellect kick in at all, then that's a good indicator that they are high in the sociopathic and psychopathic traits. But that's a whole other conversation. So how do I overcome these tendencies, these negative emotional responses that affect my decisions and my relationships? As an entrepreneur, I create a plan based on fundamental principles that can be observed and tested in the real world, and I use that plan to guide me, my decisions, and my thoughts. So when my heart comes calling and tells me to be rash or to respond to something impulsively, I turn from it and focus on the plan. I make the intellectual decision to turn away from the impulse and instead fix my mind on the principle. I choose to reject the emotional impulse and choose to operate from my intellect instead. I use my will, which sits between the two, to choose the intellectual and principled path. An important note, sometimes we struggle because we don't know what the principle is. And if we don't have that, we will find it hard to disagree with the emotions. So in that instance, we need to seek out the principle for that situation, meditate on it, and adopt it into our mindset for future reference. So for instance, when I was growing my first business, I was borrowing money and my wife was telling me we shouldn't be doing this is wrong. But I didn't know the right way to do it. I didn't know to live simply, have budgets, and take the profits from my business and reinvest that back into the business to grow the business. But I know now. Now I have a principle. So I just keep carrying out that entrepreneurial plan every day and keep turning my mind to the fundamental principles every day. And that is how I have achieved success in my life and escaped from that upbringing. So if you identify an emotionally negative, damaging response in your own life that keeps repeating, then find a principle, an intellectually rooted principle, and choose to operate on that whenever the emotions come calling. You might have an impulse to get that new piece of equipment that costs £4,000 for your business, and someone will let you have it on credit, and you have a strong desire to do that. In that situation, the principle that your intellect needs to focus on is debt is bad. This is an objectively true principle because debt puts someone else in control of a part of your life, and that ultimately means you don't have control over your two most valuable resources, which is time and money. So now you have that principle in place, you will start to brainstorm other ways to solve the problem. Maybe your iPhone is enough right now. When you're making enough money, you can upgrade. Or maybe you can find some older equipment, buy last generation equipment for cash. Maybe buy good used second-hand equipment for a fraction of the price that will do what you need. So in this instance, you question the impulse, reject it, and then start to solve the problem based on that objective principle. But you have to be willing to put the intellect in control over the emotions, over the impulses, and find other creative ways to solve the problem and stick to the plan. Keep practicing placing the intellect over the emotions, and watch how your emotions lose control over you. So here is my advice. Don't follow your heart. That will put you in the gutter. Follow your intellect rooted in principle. That will put you in a king's palace. So there are the 5 worst pieces of advice I was trained on, but I have now reversed them, and that has enabled me to escape the rat race and live my dream life. And no matter where you start from, even if like me, you were raised on benefits and have to reprogram everything you have been taught, you can do it. You can overcome your societal conditioning and take control of your life so you can live the life you want to live. But to make this work, you have to make the decision to stop listening to the 5 worst pieces of advice ever. What about you? What is the worst piece of advice you have followed and needed to correct in your life? Have a think about that. Are you struggling with any of these in particular, the ones I've mentioned? Like and subscribe if you want more videos like this, and drop a comment if there was something in particular you found useful in the whole of this video. This lets me know what content is valuable to you and what you want to know more about. We have a free online marketing training course for beginners on our website. This has over 40k plus students already enrolled and a 4.5 star rating. So if you're interested in starting your own business, I'll put a link to that below. We also have the Business Buddies community, which has over 58 hours of advanced premium training where you can join and get help from me to grow your new online business. That comes with a fee. Now, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I look forward to catching up with you in the next video.